Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles.
I'm Avi Havivi, Temple Beth Am. It's December 15th, and this is a Green Team talk. And our speaker this evening is Yeye Lobet, although if you search her online, formally her byline is Ingrid Lobet. I didn't ask her how she got to be called Yeye. I'm sure there's a story there. Anyway, Ingrid/Yeye is a freelance journalist working on issues of climate, energy, and environmental justice. She's worked in public radio and now mostly does stories in print and web format. She has a Master's of Science degree in climate science from Johns Hopkins, and she's an Angelina at this point in her life, although not from her origins. She's a member of IKAR, and this is really the first of kind of two parts, is how I envision it. We're going to try to have a session in January about our local neighborhood oil well at Pico and Doheny, which some people know a lot about and other people know nothing about. It's like, what's in that block of Pico and Doheny that you can't see anything, but it's just covered by nice walls? The answer is an oil well. And their neighborhood efforts to work on that oil well. Tonight is not going to be that talk, so it's not an advocacy talk. Tonight is really going to be informative. I heard Yeye speak, and I learned a lot about stuff that I didn't know anything about how does that oil well get to be there, and why are there all these oil fields and oil wells still on the way up La Cienega coming from the airport to our neighborhood? How much money is involved in them? Are they good for our economy and bad for the environment, or what? So Ingrid's been working on these issues as a journalist for years. So I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Hi, thanks so much for inviting me to talk with you about the oil industry in Los Angeles. Can you hear me okay? Great. And in California more broadly, and the relationship between that and climate and efforts to eventually probably phase out oil production here. We chose this date far in advance and did not know that I would have 15 NCAA Division III Ultimate Frisbee players in my house, but they're promising to be quiet. And so far they're being quiet, but if you hear noise, just let me know and I'll try and get things quieted down. I have quite a few slides, and I have maps. They have some detail on them, so you might want to maximize your screen so that you're able to see the detail on that. And oil production in Los Angeles goes back more. Let me share screen so you can see this first. I'm no expert in this, but I have been told that Edward Doheny was somebody who was working in the California. He was looking for gold, like a lot of people. And when he didn't find that. He ended up drilling the first oil well in Southern California in 1882, beginning an oil rush in what became known as the Los Angeles City oil field. And those are all derricks. They're also called rigs. That is what a derrick is. Sometimes people will call other things a derrick, but they aren't. This is what a derrick is. And they're used, they look like that because they're used to support the drill bit that makes the hole, because an oil well is a hole. And that's something that I've realized in California that's really different from Texas. Is some people don't have a visual image of what an oil well is. It's a hole, and the height of that rig is used to assemble and force the drill pipe down the hole. And you can see that one reaches down to where it says oil. That's when they stop drilling, is when they reach the bottom of the reservoir that they're looking for. And I've had engineers tell me that when oil drilling started in Los Angeles, the railroad was not connected to Southern California, so you couldn't get steel here. So some wells have no casing here at all. And some they used bored out redwood trees. And some of those are still in the ground in downtown LA. And there are still about 3,000 wells just in that Los Angeles City oil field. I understand. Some people made a lot of money doing that, which caused a lot more people to start looking for oil in other places like Signal Hill in Long Beach. And this one here is labeled Venice Beach, but I think it's actually Playa Beach, because there is an oil field under Playa del Rey, as you may know more about this already than I do, but there is an oil field under Playa del Rey. That's why we have a gas storage field there. It's because it used to have oil in it. And I think it's really interesting that pumping oil out of the ground here has actually been controversial going back 100 years. In the 1920s, there was opposition to drilling in Long Beach proper because, operators occasionally would lose control of a well and it would send oil shooting into the sky and falling down onto people and their property, and it would mess up people's vacations, and it was bad for the tourism industry, although it was good for other industries. So, there have been people who didn't like it since the 1920s. Okay, so that well hole or well bore, it doesn't have to go straight down. It can go diagonally, and more recently, it can even go directly horizontally. And some of you may know that if it goes diagonally or horizontally through property where you own the mineral rights, then you may be getting a check. And according to Era Energy, which is one of the biggest oil companies in California, there are 600,000 Californians who get oil or gas royalty checks. So I think some people in this congregation live near a well site that Avi was talking about at Pico and Doheny, near a derrick tower that was built to resemble a synagogue. And I think that was a first. So this is the official oil and gas well map of the state of California, and it's available to anyone who wants to go there. You can see where all the wells are. And that agency is now called CalGEM for the California Geologic Energy Management Division. It used to have a name that referred more directly to oil and gas, but California is plowing forward into the future and gave their agency a more progressive name. And it maintains records on just about every single oil and gas well in the state. And an interesting thing about gas wells is that since they are drilled by engineers, and since engineers are by their training very meticulous, for many wells, there are really detailed wells. So if we zoom in, this is the one that's near Doheny, and you can see if you zoom in, you can see all the wells that are there, and they're numbered. Every well in California is supposed to have an official well number. And on this map, the purple ones are the ones that are idle, which is not a permanent condition. It just means we're not pumping oil out of it anymore, and it's not our intention to be pumping oil out of it today or tomorrow. The green ones are actively having oil pumped out of them. And interestingly also is the orange ones are new ones. I don't know if you can see this is orange, but if you click on it, I was curious that they would be drilling a new one right there, but the status says that it's canceled. So maybe they had intended to drill a new one. And perhaps, I'm just speculating here, I want to be clear about that, it may be a sign of the times that something that they intended to have as a new well there has been canceled. And I'll talk a little bit more about recent changes that have really are really very powerful signals about the oil and gas industry here. So how intense is that drill site, that well site with 40 wells? Well, if we zoom out, we can get an idea. You can see there was a lot of stuff drilled around. This is Century City right here. You can see over here, I'm not sure what field this is, but it's mostly all idle, not too many, and plugged. The gray ones are permanently plugged. They have had so much concrete poured down to them that they will never produce again. And if you zoom out even farther, you can see all the wells in the area, and that now when you zoom out that much, this Beverly Hills site looks small, like it doesn't really count in the big scheme of things. But when you zoom in on it, you can see there's actually 40 wells there, which is not insignificant. Okay. So oil has brought a lot of wealth, and it's brought a lot of employment, although that employment is definitely waning, and it's way less than employment in solar and wind now in California. And with the wells came refineries, because you have to turn the crude oil into gasoline. And Los Angeles, this gets much less ink than the wells do, but Los Angeles is a refining powerhouse. And I know some people who are vegetarian feel like if you're going to eat meat, you should, see where it comes from and be conversant in that. And likewise, some people who work on oil issues in this area feel like if you're going to drive a car that takes gasoline, you should know what a refinery looks like. And we have like 6 or 7 of them here. One way you can do that is to take the 405 freeway, take the Wilmington Avenue exit, go south and make a left turn on Sepulveda. If you want to find them on a satellite map, you can look for these areas that have all these tanks. This is what's known as a tank farm. And where you have a tank farm, you usually have a refinery. And there's a refinery right here in Carson. And I think there's another one right here. Most of the refineries here in LA are in Wilmington or Carson, which borders Wilmington. But you guys probably know that there's a very large refinery also in Torrance, which has its own group that works just on clean air issues around that. Let's see here. People who live near the refineries will tell you that there's really good work there. There are also many emissions and there are accidents at refineries. Last year, there was an accident at one of the Carson refineries. And I believe that that's still, I'm not sure if they've issued the final report on what that was, but I noticed in the chat for, that's like, oh, you can see that's Sky Map 7 that shot that. In the comments on that, you had people who live near there saying, this wasn't that uncommon. And in September of this year, there was a small earthquake. Wait just a second. I've lost control of my cursor here. There was a small earthquake. And after the earthquake, there was a lot of activity at the refineries called flaring. And flaring is, the refineries will tell you that it is a safety measure because, if you send gases up the stack and you burn them off, then they cannot explode elsewhere in the refinery. That's all true. But people who live nearby will tell you that flaring, while it may be routine and it may be a safety measure, it is not necessarily a benign activity because obviously you're combusting a bunch of stuff and that smoke is going somewhere. And so refineries are a very big center of concern for environmental justice organizations. But probably what made Avi invite me here tonight is related to the role of oil in climate change. The atmosphere that we were given had a certain amount of carbon dioxide in it. It had about 280 parts per million. And as a result of natural processes, often in an annual process of growth and absorption and death and decay. And that gave us what some people called a Goldilocks planet that was not too hot and not too cold. And human civilization pretty much developed with that level of carbon dioxide, more or less. But burning fossil fuels like we're seeing here has raised that concentration of CO2 in the air to now over 400 parts per million, thanks largely to the fact that we are unburying deep stores of carbon that never would have been part of that annual carbon cycle of increase and a mild increase and decrease. In fact, if you look at graphs of CO2, they go like this in an annual cycle, but within a very narrow band. And now, because of the fossil fuels that we have brought up that had been stored for millions of years, we've really dramatically disturbed that concentration. And the use of fossil fuels needs to ramp down really steeply to zero to preserve a chance of a recognizable climate, according to the IPCC, as you probably know very well. And what we have seen with those IPCC reports is that they are extremely conservative and real life measurements keep outpacing the projections of the IPCC because it's a group of scientists and they all have to sign off on it. They all have to come to agreement. And by their training, they tend to be rather cautious. So we get these reports every 4 years, and then we measure the changes in the atmosphere and they end up being greater often than what was in the IPCC reports. And in Los Angeles, environmental justice organizations like Communities for a Better Environment and many others have been very well organized since the early 2000s, and they have been working to reduce and clean up fossil fuel infrastructure. But recently, those groups that have been doing that for a long time have been joined by other groups like housing activists and a group called People Not Pozos, which means people not wells, or other people who are connecting the dots on climate change in wealthier communities and religious congregations. And they have made remarkable change in a very brief period of time. About 90 days ago, the County Board of Supervisors did something that really surprised me. It voted to begin phasing out wells in unincorporated parts of the county. And my understanding is that means that there will be no new wells drilled in the unincorporated parts of the county. And they also declared oil drilling to be an incompatible land use, which I think gives them a grounding in law to begin contemplating shutting down production in existing wells. And I think that's a very big distinction between saying you can't drill something new versus you can't use something that you have that's operating. So I didn't do any original reporting on that, but I did do some mapping to see, well, what are the unincorporated parts of Los Angeles County let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger, that might be affected by this move. Let me see if I can move you guys so that I can have access to so the light blue here is the unincorporated county. And the dark red are active oil fields. We have other oil fields in LA County, but they're not necessarily still producing oil. So is there any place on here that anyone would like me to zoom into?
The one off La Cienega by Baldwin Hills.
Okay. I think that's the Inglewood oil field right here.
Uh-huh.
Do I have it on the screen?
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm going to show you another map of our oil fields later on, but this one I only made to see what was like the jurisdictional overlap.
Sorry, so you said the red is unincorporated and
the red is the active oil fields,
and then blue is unincorporated. Okay.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so it affects the marina, affects that La Cienega corridor.
And I actually, if I can find the chat, maybe when I stop sharing, I get access to the chat because I'm not seeing where I get it right now. Oh yeah, there I have the chat. Okay, I'm going to put the link for this in the chat, and that way you can look at it at your leisure if you want. Okay. Then in mid-October, Governor Gavin Newsom also surprised a lot of us when he did what the community activists have actually been working for years, but said that new wells have to be pretty far away from houses and schools, like more than a half a mile, 3,200 feet. And before that, a lot of people had been talking about, can we get a 500-foot setback? And can they get a 1,000-foot setback? And those efforts had failed. And then he announced it's going to be 3,200 feet. So, that's a pretty big deal. And now people are talking about the city acting, and if and when the city acts, that will be an even bigger deal. And that's because that's where a lot of oil is coming from, the Wilmington and Long Beach area. So you can see that even in the grand scheme of things, with California, that a lot of oil is coming out of the ground near Long Beach and Wilmington. But apparently, the city is actually considering limiting or phasing out oil production in the city of Los Angeles. 9 of the 15 Los Angeles City Council members publicly expressed support for the county phase out. And the city attorney has said that the city does have that authority. I think at IKAR, someone from the Green Action said they were involved in, meetings with city council members. Now the energy companies argue that any constriction of oil production in California will only lead to importing more oil. So this is where the oil that comes into California refineries came from in 2019. I always thought when I heard, if you just shut it down in one place, it will come from somewhere else. I thought that was true. That seemed true, but apparently there are people who say that it is not true. the Stockholm Environment Institute, which is scholarly, everybody's got a PhD, I think, there, says leaving oil in the ground in one place is a way to reduce global oil consumption. The person who leads the climate policy program there says, in the big picture, it is just not true that if you leave some oil undeveloped, it will be substituted for 1-for-1 with someone else's oil. So I'll just wrap up this part with me doing all the talking by saying something you probably already know, which is that we're in a massive energy transition. The entire vehicle fleet is turning over to electricity. We don't know how fast. A few companies are still betting on hydrogen, but that ultimately is an electricity process also. The entire electrical system that delivers electricity to our lights and plugs is transitioning away from coal, and we'll have to transition off natural, aka fossil gas, and that transition is underway. Young people who are just entering the workforce are facing an unprecedented array of possibilities to pursue their careers and simultaneously address the climate crisis. And I'm happy to take any of your questions or revisit any of those slides that you'd like any more detail on.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. So big picture in terms of energy needs, and we might all use our air conditioners less and have some modest energy use reduction, but I think how much that's going to be is pretty limited. And you didn't talk about this because it's not your topic, but is there really capacity for things like solar and wind to substitute, or is that unrealistic? Does it need to be more nuclear powered? Does there need to be some scientific breakthrough for some energy source that we don't really have access to yet? So I'm asking kind of a big picture question.
Yeah, that's totally fine to ask that.
We'll have
Thank
electric
you.
cars and electric this and electric that, and where's all that electricity going to come from? What's the vision of that, let's say 50 years down the line?
I don't think anybody wants to look at 50 years down the line because there is so much engineering breakthrough happening now. I mean, they do try to project how much, what the demand is going to be. And then they and we're trying to get to zero carbon as fast as possible, zero carbon emissions. And in fact, I believe that's the law, or at least the edict from the governor in this state. I hear your question as being about electricity, not transportation, but they are related. And so we have already, many of the utilities have eliminated the coal fired power that they were purchasing from out of state. We mostly weren't creating that dirtiest electricity in our state, but we definitely were importing it from the Southwest, Arizona and New Mexico. And I believe LADWP is the one that has dramatically reduced its, but I think the state of California is still getting some. They're trying to replace that as fast as possible with a build out of solar and a build out also of, we're starting to build out offshore wind, which has some potential in California. Where offshore wind gets built is in part a function of where you have brisk wind blowing, and we have maps of the world and the United States that show where the faster wind is. And for those of you who remember your math formulas at all, the reason why it really matters how fast the wind is blowing is because the power that you can extract from a column of air that a turbine is pulling in is related to the cube of the wind speed. So the power increases really fast with a small increase in wind speed. And that's a new thing that's happening off the Northern California coast, where we have our faster wind speeds. And the reason why our wind turbines can now produce 100 times more power than what those early dinky ones from the 1980s in Altamont and Tehachapi could produce is because they have gotten higher and they can reach these faster. They're also just engineered a lot better. Those were basically experimental in the 1980s, and now it's a whole huge industry. But So you can replace a lot of it with the technology we have. The biggest question in electricity is how do you take the excess? We now have tons of excess electricity on our grid at certain hours, and we don't have enough electricity on our grid at other hours. So how can you store what is great excess and even being turned off during afternoons when the demand is not that high, but we have huge production, and just shift it so that we can use it overnight. And ideally, we would like to be able to have more flexibility where we can not only use it overnight, but we can use it the next day if it's super overcast or whenever we really want to. And right now, we're building out huge arrays of lithium battery packs right on the same sites as our solar arrays for exactly that reason, so that the solar collectors can feed directly into the batteries, and that extends the functioning hours of the solar array from being not just from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., but 9 a.m. to maybe 9 p.m. But that's still not what we need. We still need more breakthroughs. And, that is like some of the hottest work in university engineering departments right now. And there are probably 20 experimental battery chemistries to create that longer term storage. And there's all these startups that are seeking, the capital that they need to take their project from either the lab to a pilot or from a pilot to a real world demonstration project. And that is one of the priorities of the state of California. And now the Biden administration Department of Energy is to get those hundreds of millions of dollars out the door so that anybody who's got one of those promising ideas is not held back by a lack of funding. Long answer, but you asked a good question. Yes. Wait, I can't hear you.
Alan, then Miriam.
Then Miriam. So I'm curious if there's, you talked about political action around stopping drilling or stopping the pumping within the state, within the county, within the city. I'm curious if there's been much discussion within those deliberations around kind of the near-term economic impact that it creates. So you had mentioned, if you a barrel of oil left in the ground doesn't necessarily get replaced, but the reason for that is that the barrel of oil left in the ground ends up reducing supply and therefore increasing price. And so there's some sort of price elasticity. And so consumption goes down a little bit, but there's definitely an economic cost associated with it. And the citizens end up suffering a little bit from an economic standpoint. And so I'm curious if that's really a significant factor within these deliberations, or if people are just really kind of, we have to go green, we have to, cut CO2, and we'll just do it however we need to.
I think, that's a great question. I think that actually has been a very serious, I'm not a Sacramento reporter, so I don't sit in on all those hearings or hear the policy deliberations of the Air Resources Board or the different committees, but I think that that's probably why it has taken this long. If you're going to hear later from an activist, they're going to tell you that they have been trying to do this for so many years. And in the meantime, the egregiousness of actual felt climate change has gotten so much more acute. But the reason why it has taken this long is because there can be an economic effect. Now, again, the different administrations and many people are working as hard as they can to drive down the cost of batteries so that there's absolute parity between electric cars. You don't have to pay any premium for an electric car. There are also, there's also rebates for that same reason to make it so, because it costs less over time to have an electric car there, but there has been an upfront cost. But they're trying to eliminate it so there's no upfront cost. And so then people can switch, and also so that people who would not yet be in a position to even buy a new car are able to switch, just like they have been trying for 30 years to make the California fleet cleaner with cleaner internal combustion cars. Now, it's to eliminate gasoline cars, to give people a real alternative so that they aren't having to pay a gas premium, because as you point out or imply, there are people who have absolutely no choice about how many miles they drive in a day. They absolutely have to drive from out county to get to where the work is. I think people are very concerned about putting the squeeze on people who can't afford it. And the other side of that argument is what is not being factored into that equation is the cost of inaction. and we are starting to see the cost of inaction. We're losing the Sierra. I don't think anybody can argue that we're not. No, it's not only climate change, but there's not going to be any impact that's going to knock on the door and say, hey, I was brought to you 100% by climate change. It's always going to be an accelerator, something that makes something that existed more egregious or more harmful or causes more human suffering than what it would have caused or what it caused before.
Miriam.
Yeah.
I've read that there's harm to birds with the wind turbines and to some of the tortoises in the desert with the solar panels. What can you say about that?
There has been a tendency of some urban thinkers to think, well, that's the desert, that's desolate. We can fill that up with solar collectors. But there's also a lot of, under the Obama administration, I believe, for example, in California, they charted the whole of our desert areas to create, and that was done very much in conjunction with wildlife biologists and environmental organizations that are concerned about species conservation, so that there could be more, so that it wouldn't be haphazard, so that a developer wouldn't just be able to say, I got a good deal on this piece of land, and so this is where I want to put a solar farm, but so that there would be a planning process behind it where there were areas that people had pre-screened to be more apt and less likely to hurt the desert tortoise. I don't think that they've eliminated that concern. And the desert is going to mean a lot more to some people than it does to others. People out in the desert often feel like, why don't you fill up your rooftops first and then build stuff out in the desert? That's a really legitimate conversation to have. But I do think that there's pretty much solid agreement that the electricity system has to stop putting new carbon into the atmosphere one way or another. And smart people should get together and think about whether we've maximized everything on urban rooftops. Clearly we haven't. And whether we're doing desert solar in the smartest way. With respect to wind, that was a bigger concern earlier. You've probably seen the really old wind towers. They had a lattice work. Like birds thought, oh, that's a great place to build a nest. They don't put them on. They don't put turbines on those, attractive towers anymore. The blades spin a lot slower than they used to. There is an effort to keep the wind, the new wind farms out of migration corridors. They still do kill some birds. The people who build them say they kill a lot fewer birds, I believe this is true, than domesticated cats do. But again, it's an area where there's been a lot of collaboration because a lot of the people who want wind are the same people who don't really want to kill birds. And they have been collaborating for a long time. I don't know the current status of it, but I know that we're not where we were in the 1980s and the 1990s. There's been a lot of progress since then.
Actually, I have one more question that I've wanted to ask for a long time. We put in solar panels on our roof several years ago, and we know nothing about maintaining them or how much they're actually producing. Can you say anything about that or who we could contact to find out?
Is it accessible? Can you get up there?
I don't know.
So I think that that you can get like a 5% or 6 or 7% boost if they're clean over when they're dirty. And I recently saw something really cool because there's a lot of agro solar. People are experimenting with having them be higher off the ground and grazing animals underneath. In some places where climate change is already making it too hot to grow crops that people were used to growing, they're looking at shading and actually growing crops under. And so for that, all that to say that there are combines that are being retrofitted to go with agro-solar. And I saw a combine that was retrofitted with a rotating brush, and it was going down the line and it was brushing clean a line of solar collectors. It was a really cool video. I think it's helpful to have it clean. I don't think it takes a huge ding from it. There are starting to be companies that will come and do like a checkup on your solar system, and they will tell you, like, are there any cells that are not producing? Are you getting out of it what you should be getting out of it? Do I know anything else about it? the new systems that get, installed, they put an app on your phone because people want to know now, right? They've gotten used to seeing everything that will show them like, oh, I'm producing X amount right now. But people who were more forward looking and installed their systems earlier, or early adopters, often don't have that app technology. So you're more reliant on a services company.
Could you send information to Avi to send to me so I can look into that?
Yeah, sure. Like the service sector.
Yeah. How to get it clean so it produces better.
I clean mine, but mine are accessible. I don't know if yours are accessible.
No. And my husband and I are not handy at all. So
I do want to say, Miriam, that later, meaning in the first half of 2022, the Green Team we do plan on sponsoring a talk about home solar.
Oh, great.
Yeah. So it's not on the calendar, but it is on the agenda. Right, because we all have questions about it. You, who has solar, has questions. I, who do not yet have solar, have questions. They're talking about changing the tax law. What are the implications of all this? So there's a lot of information that those of us who are not solar experts would like to have and need to have. Alan?
So going back to oil and gas, so the changes that are being contemplated in California and locally would reduce production in the state. Do you have a sense of what the impact would be at a global scale in terms of what percentage of oil and gas is produced within California? What percentage of the U.S. or what percentage of global production?
I meant to look up the percent of global production, and that's a good question because it's a commodity, but I don't know the answer. Something that's interesting about our oil is that despite the fact that United States oil production has skyrocketed, and in fact, we've become a net exporter, California, that doesn't really affect California's oil situation that much because we're not connected to their pipeline systems for the most part. Our oil comes from, like this thing shows, comes from California or from Alaska, or it comes in from by boat, by tanker. And a little bit of it, like I think maybe 3% comes in from rail. And it was Bakersfield that built a rail terminal, I think, most recently. But we're not connected to all the controversial pipelines that we hear about, which are connected to the newly fracked, the Permian Basin and the Eagle Ford, and then, of course, North Dakota.
And the Gulf.
And the Gulf, yeah. Yeah, and the Gulf, of course.
Right. So the other thing you had mentioned was...
Well, I said fracked, so yeah, I don't know, that Gulf. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, but those are the big sources of domestic production, so the Gulf and then the terrestrial sources. In terms of the energy intensity associated with extracting the oil, you talked about some of the thicker, heavier, sour crude in California that requires steam and more treatment. Is there a comparison of how the energy consumption associated with that sort of extraction versus the energy consumption of bringing oil over from the other side of the world? Yes.
As a matter of fact, that's why I made that map in the first place. And that's what this column is right here. So you can see that the very most, and we should say that, like, I think most of the carbon from crude oil and gasoline comes when we combust it and burn it as its final product. But it is also important to look at, the atmosphere doesn't care, is it being released into the atmosphere during the production or the refining or the burning. I just want to put out there that the burning of it is larger than these numbers. But you can see the very most carbon intensive is what we get from Canada. 31. This is grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule of energy contained in the raw fuel. And interestingly, some of the very, very least, I said this in my last talk because we were closer to the spill in Orange County, some of the very lowest carbon oil that we get is what's offshore and what was leaking out of that pipeline. It's like 1.5 or between 1.5 and 3. Yeah, here it says U.S. offshore outer continental shelf, 1.5 to 8. So this is like 7 times or, multiple times more than that.
Why is the Canadian oil so energy intensive? Is it thicker, or is that because of fracking?
It's because it's for a very similar reason to why the California oil in the Midway Sunset Field is so carbon intensive. It's like this stuff right here in our biggest, most prolific field. It's because you have to burn a fuel. Usually up in Canada, it's also natural gas to create steam, to heat the stuff up, to get it to come out of the ground.
So it's
tar.
It's sludgier oil.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of an oversimplification, but yeah, they have actually a couple of different processes there. They have in situ removal. Alan might know about this. And then there's another process. It's not all the same. As you may know, since we're talking about nature and geology, every single field is different. And that's why we need engineers, to be able to figure out how to get stuff out. But yeah, Canadian oil is extremely carbon intensive oil. That's another reason why people are against it. But some California oil is quite clean. Like here in Ventura, this is coated yellow around Ventura because this is relatively, it's not very carbon intensive oil at all. And up here in Santa Maria either. And what's this field right here in Los Angeles? Fullerton, Anaheim. These Beverly Hills actually, 5 grams. So compared to 30 from Canada compared to 8.
So it kind of argues for local production as opposed to importing as much as we are.
What is local? Well, because this is where we get most of it in California. And if we just said local, then that would probably include that too, right?
Yeah, true.
But some of it must flow, when you drill into it. And I think that this other stuff that in these most prolific fields doesn't flow when you just drill it.
Miriam, you're muted still.
I've chanced on some webinars about Native Americans in North Dakota and Canada fighting the oil. Is this related to the tar sands?
I don't think I should speak about that. I don't think I know enough about it. All I do know is that very often pipelines run through aquifers and, in places where people feel like they've been protecting their source of water forever. In the case of Native Americans, there's a lot of spills. There are a lot of pipeline ruptures. And up in that part of the country, something that's rather fresh in their memory is a rupture in the Kalamazoo River in Michigan. I guess it's not that close, but sorry about coughing. I forgot about the microphone. And that was pretty bad. They're still cleaning that up. And I think it's been a decade since then. So nobody can tell you our pipeline is guaranteed against rupture. So I think that's the ones who call themselves water keepers. I think that's the main concern.
Oh, that it gets into the water?
Yeah, the pipelines often run through the water source. Because pipelines have to go underneath rivers and through groundwater basins.
Because there's an intensive fight going on with Native Americans in Canada that it's hurting their rice fields, their native lands, their sacred lands.
Is that near the tar sands?
Some of it is.
Is it in Alberta? The person that you have who comes next might really want to talk about that. And I'd be happy to talk about it if I knew. I just don't know.
Okay.
But if you prompt her or him, let them know you want to know that. Maybe they'll study up or maybe they already know.
Right. Okay. I could get the information for that because I've chanced on some webinars and some activism about it.
Yeye, I have a question just about the visual of all of those oil rigs right next to each other. So you said that the actual well might go in different directions. So are those all underground going in different directions, or is it the issue that you can only bring up as much per hour or whatever as the diameter of the bore. And so having more of them going into the same well just brings up more oil. It's just odd to me. It looks odd to me that there are multiple wells all go, which would at least superficially look like they're all going into the same oil field.
Sometimes it's different depths.
That's one thing in this really super early thing in the 1880s or around 1900. What I've been told, I don't know if this is true uniformly, it could be what Alan said, that they're different depths, is that they were pretty shallow. So in some cases, they were very shallow. So there's a couple of things that could be going on. One could be that these have different owners. So I want to get what's in that pool before you get what's in that pool. Or like we were talking about, that with different geology, we used to be, one reason for close spacing of wells in the past would be if that oil formation underground was what they call tight sands. In that case, in the older days before fracking, you needed to have many wells in order to be, because the formation was very tight and it wouldn't allow you to suck up a lot of oil with a some straw. But when fracking was developed, that was part of the beauty of it, was that from one bore you could fracture rock in many directions and then free up the product to flow into your line and no longer be confined to that really close spacing. But I don't know if either one of those reasons is the reason why these are so close together. But I do agree with you. They're remarkably close together. In all the ones I've seen of LA, they seem, even these are kind of close together. But on the other hand, that one in Beverly Hills, I think, was drilled many years later. I'm not certain about that, but I think, let's see if we can get a date on that. Wasn't that like in the 1960s? Do you know how long that one has been near where you are?
The one right outside of Beverly Hills. There was also the one that was on the high school grounds too, in Beverly Hills High School, which I think has been shut down.
I meant to tell you guys that you can get the whole record for this. You click on this and then it says the well record. That's what you look for. And it used to be I could just click on it and see the well record just like that. Look down and you'll see the drawings the engineers made in the 1930s. Now you have to request it, but you can just request it and they will email it to you. And you will be able to see what year it was drilled, which if you have any concern about a facility, it's nice to know what year's technology was in use at the time. It'll also tell you what type of protective stuff is on there, like is there a blowout preventer and is there a shutoff valve at the bottom of the well? Like at Aliso Canyon, there wasn't. And that's why that blowout, which was gas, not oil, it was gas that was being stored in a former oil formation. That's why it was so disastrous, is because there was not a very common piece of equipment at the bottom of the well that would have been able to shut it off.
I have another question, which you should feel free to answer just as a journalist in terms of what you know. I'm sure I don't have the facts of this right, but in that thing of how many people on the city council are on record as being in favor of limitation on drilling, it is my understanding that one of those people is not Paul Koretz, in whose district that oil well is. And do you know anything about that or why that is in terms of what's on the record?
The only thing not my reporting at all, just reading other people's reporting, I have heard him say we're going to be sued. And, California regulatory authorities get sued all the time. And, that's why we have clean vehicle standards and stuff, is because the Air Resources Board has been like, sue us. We read the statute. We think we can do it. Go ahead and sue us. I've read that his position, I think, I could be wrong about this, but no, I'm pretty sure it was Paul Koretz said, I don't want to be on the other side of the people I'm going to have to be on the other side of. And we could lose this.
Sorry, we meaning the city of Los Angeles.
If we act and if we do this,
the city of Los Angeles.
Yes, the city of Los Angeles, we're obviously going to be sued, and not clear what the outcome of that is going to be. So I know very little about it, and I know very little about city politics in general. that's really not my area, but I think that I've read that that's Councilmember Correz's position.
And I think there will be more on that in the next session that we have about the one that we're planning hopefully for January about our local.
I mean, that's a challenging issue, right? So if you're seizing property without just compensation, that's the Constitution says you can't do that. So the city would have to do something to make them whole.
Well, I don't know what the issue is. I don't know if it's seizing property or just saying wells can't drill. So obviously a complicated issue that we need more information.
Well, if you shut down existing production, then you are definitely taking something away from somebody who is currently deriving revenue. That's why I always try to, remind people of the difference between saying no new wells. That can also definitely be argued that it's a taking of property, but it's even more obvious when you are closing down something that's currently producing. But it's not, there are refineries closing, and I'm not an expert on the trend, but there are oil companies that have said we're leaving California. There are fields that have been sold and people have left. I've had people tell me that the expertise for a lot of stuff like plugging wells has moved away because the industry has been in decline for a long time. Some refineries are switching to biofuels. So if they did do it, we might look back in hindsight and say, oh yeah, that was part of something that was happening. It might not run counter to trend. Still, I will be very surprised if it happens.
Any other questions? All right, I'd like to wrap up, and I want to say, Yeye Lobet, Ingrid Lobet, thank you very much for sharing all this material and educating us. It's really great. I learned a lot. It sounds like Alan knew a lot beforehand. I hope he learned something new.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. And sorry we had a small turnout in person, where usually we'll have about 10 times as many people listening to the podcast. So it does have legs. So thanks a lot, everyone, for coming, and keep your eye on Temple Beth Am Green Team mailings for what's going to happen in January.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.